How to become a customer of choice to your suppliers. Miguel Cossio is Senior Research Director with Gartner. Hello, Miguel.
Hello, Bob. Good to see you again.
Thank you for being with me. Miguel, what is a customer of choice?
So, a customer of choice is a company that consistently receives priority or access to scarce resources from a large number of suppliers, right? So, if
Mhm.
you think about your suppliers and the suppliers that buying organizations have, they can tell if they are a customer of choice, if they are consistently getting that priority access.
Mhm. We've heard that phrase used before when it comes to transportation contracting, whether it's the carrier or the shipper who has the balance of power. And it seems by talking about customer of choice with suppliers, you're suggesting that the balance of power more recently has shifted to that of suppliers, that they can pick and choose who they want to work with. Is that indeed the case?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the data we have says that in the last couple of years, the importance of supplier collaboration has increased for 88% of organizations out there.
Mhm.
Everybody's interested in increasing that collaboration, in becoming that customer of choice. And if you need proof, like think about what happened during the COVID pandemic, right? Like companies weren't getting enough capacity from suppliers, and whatever capacity suppliers had, it was going to the customer of choice of those suppliers.
Mhm.
So definitely one of the things I always say is the best suppliers out there can choose who they partner with from a customer perspective. So
Mhm.
yes, in some cases the power dynamics has definitely shifted.
And yet at the same time, we still hear about buyers doing things like stretching payment terms to suppliers, which obviously is a disincentive to a supplier to work with them. How do you reconcile that particular trend toward the need to become a customer of choice?
That is definitely a problem. So
Hmm.
there is a misunderstanding where people think where if you're trying to be a customer of choice, you need to pay more, right? That's not necessarily the case, right? So
Right.
the conversations of savings on how do we optimize costs still need to happen, but it's the way those conversations are happening, right? From a
Yeah.
do this or else to a more collaborative approach. Increasing payment terms with suppliers unidirectionally and just saying this is it, otherwise we'll take the business away is definitely a sure way to stop being a customer of choice to your suppliers.
What else do companies typically do wrong in their relationship and collaboration with suppliers? What common misconceptions do they have that threaten their relationship with suppliers?
So there's several things, right? So first of all, I see a lot of companies that when they are creating a strategy to try to become a customer of choice, to collaborate more with suppliers, they primarily focus on what's in for them as buyers, right?
Mm.
So it is a problem. I mean, I've seen data that says that 40%, up to 40% of organizations don't even have a strategy to become a customer of choice or improve collaboration. But those that do, they focus on what's in it for them, right? So how can they optimize the resources and focus on the right suppliers, et cetera, et cetera, where
Mhm.
the focus should be on what the suppliers want the most. How can we be a better customer to our supplier? How can we be easier to work with, more attractive, which not necessarily includes paying more
Yeah.
from a buying perspective. But that is
Well,
definitely one mistake that I see.
that raises the question of how do you know that? How do you find out what your suppliers want?
That's a very I guess if you've been in supply chain you long enough you already get a sense, right? But things that a simple way that I see and recommend people think do this is just ask them, right? There's the concept of voice of supplier or supplier satisfaction surveys where we see a lot of big corporations going out and asking a large group of suppliers, what do these suppliers think about them in terms of cost of doing business,
Hmm.
how easy it is to do business with them and interact with their systems, how knowledgeable their staff is, etc. Right. So rather than trying to just figure out what suppliers want, you need to ask them, right? And based on some of those things, then you can start identifying areas of improvement. This is very similar to a employee engagement survey that many people listening to us today that they're doing in their companies, right? So
Yeah.
like companies running these engagement surveys and then using those to engage better employees.
Well, I can imagine a company putting out a survey to its suppliers to say, hey, I put out a survey. My job is done. Obviously, that's not the case. What then do you do? What do you do with the information that,
Absolutely.
that makes it an effective move on your part?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen large companies in high tech, for example, using that feedback from suppliers that score as one key metric that they track next to payment terms, next to delivery, next to cost, right? They are tracking that. But in essence, the right way of doing some of these things is, first of all, you ask suppliers for feedback. Once you receive that feedback, you start identifying what are the areas that you are able to improve, right? That you're willing to improve, because let's face it, some areas you're not willing to improve, like, for example, payment terms, right?
Yeah.
But you identify areas of opportunities, and then you circle back with suppliers and share what are the things that you've identified that you're going to be putting in place. That, to me, is one of the easiest, it's not easy, but it's one of the easiest and most impactful things you can do to start sending the message to suppliers that their opinion matters and you're trying to be a better customer.
I could see a buyer making the rationale that really they need to focus these efforts mostly on their most strategic suppliers. Is that a misconception?
I believe it's not a misconception, but it's an incomplete vision.
Mm,
So most research papers and comments that you will find on this topic, everybody says you should focus on your strategic suppliers. And again, I think that's an incomplete vision. You should focus on your strategic suppliers first, but then you have to figure out how do you become a customer choice to as many suppliers as you can, right?
yeah.
Because the reality is, if you have 50 strategic suppliers and then 2,000 non-strategic suppliers, and those 50 love you, but the rest hate you, you have a problem.
Yeah. And we, of course, know that the lack of a single tiny minor part in a production plan can bring everything to a grinding halt. So,
Absolutely. And the concept is not that you should be having quarterly business reviews with absolutely all of your suppliers. Absolutely not. What you should be thinking about is using a set of different collaboration mechanisms to engage suppliers depending on their importance to your business, right? So
yeah.
you might have your business reviews with your most strategic suppliers. With less strategic suppliers, maybe you do a voice of the supplier survey, right? Where you're collecting feedback, right? Or you're doing supplier summits where you're getting more suppliers from not just your strategic suppliers on together, and then share more things with them, right? It's
Yeah.
really about figuring out the right balance of activities with the supplier importance, but everybody should be under the radar or scope.
There are no lack of ways to communicate with people virtually. How important is it that buyers actually physically meet up with suppliers? I mean, during COVID-19, obviously that was impossible. Nobody was going anywhere. How important is it now that personal face-to-face visits be undertaken on a regular basis?
I think it's definitely important. A lot of companies tried staying virtual after with suppliers, right? When it comes down to supplier interactions after COVID, and many haven't seen the same level of value, right, from those interactions. I do believe it's important to spend face time with suppliers, but in that case, I would definitely focus on strategic suppliers, right? When you're thinking
Yeah.
about that FaceTime, it's not, you can still be a customer of choice. You can still send clear signals to suppliers in terms of being a better customer to work with, even if you're not meeting with them face to face, right?
Yeah. Yeah. With all the pressure these days on complying with environmental, social, and governance or ESG regulations, rules, and concerns, a lot of buyers are putting out supplier codes of conduct,
Mhm.
dictating to a certain extent how their suppliers are performing in those key ways. How do you do that without making it feel overly oppressive to a supplier?
So that's a good question. So generally speaking, the new wave of requirements on ESG, it's actually forcing companies to be more collaborative with suppliers, right?
Mhm.
Because if you think about deeper topics like scope three emissions, right? Like, and asking suppliers to reduce their emissions, this is a new agenda item, right? And many
Right.
suppliers don't even know how to get started, and that's where collaboration comes in place. To your point about not being oppressive on some of these things, I do believe there are things that we can definitely do to make lives on our suppliers easier, right? So things like, don't send suppliers or don't place requirements that no one else in the industry is placing on those requirements, right? So
Mhm.
align to what your peers in your industry are doing, and you can do that via an industry association or whatnot, right? Use tools that your suppliers are already using to report to other companies in your industry as well, right? Don't come up with your own Excel-based spreadsheet to ask suppliers for questions, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do, but the reality is, I mean, there are going to be requirements that are from a compliance perspective that no matter what, modern slavery is not permitted in our supply chain, right? So there's really no collaboration or negotiation on some of these topics, right? It depends
Yeah.
on the outcomes on some of these ESG topics, but collaboration is definitely something that is taking center stage for companies to deliver this.
Miguel Cossio of Gartner, I want to thank you so much for helping to drive home the importance of being a customer of choice to your suppliers and how companies can go about doing just that. Thank you very much for being with me today.
Great to be here, Bob. Thank you.